Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Shakayla Alvarenga, and I will be serving as the moderator for tonight's discussion, where we will delve into the topic of mental health among first responders. Thank you all for joining us. So I'd like to introduce our panelists for this evening's program. To my left here is Bill Gibbs, the manager of the Police Employee Assistance Program. Next to him is Dr. Trudy Gilbert-Elliott, a local therapist. Next to her is Harry Fagel, a retired LVMPD officer. And last but not least, Sergeant Travis Maka with the Nevada Highway Patrol. Please give a round of applause for our panelists. So first, I'd like to begin by discussing the origins of PEAP, the Police Employee Assistance Program. So in 1984, Detective Ed Jensen and Lieutenant Jerry Keller lost a colleague to suicide, and they decided to spearhead the establishment of PEAP. Now, over the years, PEAP has expanded to include a manager and peer counselors who provide immediate trauma support. Its primary goal is to, quote, ensure the emotional health and well-being of all employees, recognizing the unique stressors specific to the field of law enforcement. Bill Gibbs, we will start with you. What led you to your current role at PEAP?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. And it's quite a simple story of what drew me to it. Like when Harry came on the police department, similar that most people back in those days, Ed Jensen and Jerry Keller started the program, but people didn't really take to it. They didn't buy into it to the point where, you have an employer and you don't know if you can trust them. You also work in an atmosphere where a lot of macho folks, right? A lot of testosterone and can't show weakness. If you're struggling, maybe you shouldn't be doing that job. We'll get to it later, but that is starting to flip. But I was involved in an officer-involved shooting back in 2011. I was on the side of a freeway. I was a motor officer at the time and doing what motor officers do, writing traffic citation. And a construction worker brought a female over to me who was bleeding down her back, who told me her boyfriend just shot her in the back with a shotgun, and he's down on the off-ramp shooting at passing vehicles. I was sure he was mistaken. I couldn't hear any gunshots, but I looked down there and I see this gentleman doing just that. So a construction worker was coming up the hill to get away from this gentleman, and I hailed him down and asked him if he can get me down closer to where this shooter was at, which thankfully he did. He doesn't do this for a living, so I was very grateful to him. He took a big scoopful of dirt in front of his earth mover, and myself and another officer started down towards this officer and towards this suspect, got with about 75 feet of him, and he started firing at us. The construction worker stopped and said, "This is as far as I go." So my partner and I, we split off, trying to flank him in two different directions. And when I poked my head out from behind the piece of equipment I was hiding behind, I could see him with the shotgun zeroing in on where my partner just went, waiting for him to step out. So I figured, now's my chance. I have to do something right now. I was quite a distance away, but I was just very careful. And you hear about guys saying when they get involved in something like this, everybody falls back on their training, and it's true, because I started replaying in my head what they tell us at the range. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze, squeeze. Focus on your front sight. So I'm doing just that, and then the gun goes off, but only a slight pop, not even a loud gunshot. And Dr. Gilbert can speak about this later, about auditory exclusion and how the body does what it does during times of stress like that. You hardly hear anything, and we're always trained that if you ever have to exercise deadly force, don't expect that person's going to fall like in a movie. They might not go down, but he did immediately. And I said, "Johnny, I think I got him," and we started over towards him and hopped a little jersey wall, and he's laying flat on his back, and I start to handcuff him, and he starts fighting. And he's strong, and he's on drugs. He was a drug runner for the Mexican mafia. He was out of his mind, and he was very powerful. He's trying to get my gun out of my holster, saying, "I'm going to do to you what you did to me." And I said, "Johnny, he's trying to get my gun. He's trying to get my gun." And I see a weapon coming out of my peripheral vision, and I assume Johnny is going to shoot him, because Johnny can justifiably shoot him at that point. And I start hearing, brrrr. Johnny's tasing him. But the taser, he fired at such close range, both leads were very close to his to one another, and he wasn't getting that full body lockup. And this guy just reached up and pulled him out. So I just started doing everything I could, throwing elbows in his face and punching him square in the nose. And the guy had been shot and tased, but he didn't like getting punched right here, and started to roll on the side. I was able to get him handcuffed. And I stood up, and I hear, I'm bloody, and I'm like, what the heck just happened? And I hear, woohoo! I look over, it's a construction worker standing up on his piece of equipment. he yells, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. He comes over and he gave me a big bear hug. He's a huge guy, and I stay in contact with this guy. I contact him every year on the anniversary of the shooting, just to thank him for what he did. I mean, I eventually got recognized for our agency's highest award with the Medal of Valor, but I made sure when, at that time, Sheriff Doug Gillespie took me out to lunch to talk about the shooting, and to make sure that he knew I had his support. I wanted to make sure this construction worker was recognized, and he was. He was at the same ceremony where I got my award. He got his as well. But yeah, that's really cool. But it was right after that shooting. You're placed in the back placed in the back of a police car, and you're thinking, boy, I think I did the right thing. I did a good thing. But now detectives start showing up, and they're pointing where it happened, and they're pointing at you, and you're like, wait a minute. I think I did the right thing, right? And your mind is racing, and nobody wants to talk to you. The supervisors will come and say what they have. They have to read a certain script to you, the public safety statement, and they step away from you. Nobody wants to talk to you. They don't want to interfere with the investigation. So you're just left in your own world thinking about what's going to happen next, right? And along comes PEEP. I knew of PEEP in my time on the agency, but I never had any use for them. You know, that's for the guys who can't do this for a living, and they're too weak, right? That's what people thought, a lot of people thought. And this guy put my hand on my shoulders. He said, are you okay? Do you need anything? Do you want to go get a drink of water? Do you want to go use the bathroom? You don't have to stay here. I mean, I felt like a prisoner in the back of the patrol car, right? He's telling, did you call your wife? I'm like, oh yeah, I'm married, right? My wife, Melissa's here in the front row. So. But he just brought me back down to earth and said, you know what, I'm not part of this investigation. I'm just going to tell you what happens next. And that's huge. I mean, you've been through this incident, but now what happens, right? What happens with the investigation? What happens to me? And he just laid it out for me, this guy from PEEP, and said he was going to be with me through the whole process to the end. And that meant so much. When he patted me on the back, and I felt the weight of the world lifting off me. I said, boy, if I ever could do that for somebody else, I'd really like to do that. Unfortunately, 4 years later, I was appointed up there. There are positions that are appointed by the sheriff. I was fortunate enough to get one of them. 2 years later, I promoted to manager, and I've been there ever since, and I just love what I do.
After the shooting, what was your experience like going back to work and adjusting?
You know, I've told the story before that I think I'm pretty well adjusted, and I think a lot, we talk about, especially now, that we need to be more proactive and build resiliency in our employees, right? Not playing catch up. Let's react to what they're going through. Let's try to prevent them from going through some bad stuff, right? So I had always rehearsed in my head the what ifs, and we're told that as cops, but a lot of people don't do it. What if this happens? What are you going to do? What if this happens? If somebody bursts into this room right now, what am I going to do? I think about that stuff, and most people in law enforcement do think about that kind of stuff. So I had always thought that. I was always anticipating that the day may come where I may have to do something like that. And so when the day came, and I had rehearsed it so much in my head, and we have such great training at Metro with reality-based training, I felt like I was in another training scenario and just doing what I was trained to do and what I thought I might have to do one day and be prepared to do. And I think I came out pretty good on the other end. I remember thinking to myself at the incident, I was sitting in the back of the patrol car looking at my hand, and I was like, my hand's not shaking. I was always concerned if I got in an officer-involved shooting, I'd be shaking so badly that I wouldn't be able to get on target and strike the guy. I had the longest handgun officer-involved shooting in our agency's history. It was 38 yards. And I'm not the world's greatest marksman. I don't claim to be a sniper, but you know what? That day I was, and that's all that mattered, and that's because I think I fell back on my training and was prepared to do that. That being said, you asked how I reacted to it. I thought I was doing well. My very first car stop when I came back to duty, there's the whole process you go through. When that Metro does not rush our folks back to work when they're involved in incidents. They make sure that people are right before they go back. And they did with me. And when I went back, simple, again, I was a traffic officer, speeding stop. I stopped somebody for speeding, just a John Q. citizen, normal person. And walking up to the car, now my hands were shaking. I was like, why is this happening, And I wanted to hold my gun belt because I didn't want them to see my hands shaking. So I handled that, and over time, it got better. And I'm just thankful that the agency does what they do for us and puts us through the training they do after involved in these kinds of instances, because we don't, sadly, some agencies give folks a couple days off and right back to work they go, and I think we do it the right way.
I gotta throw something in here, because I think what I would like to express to everyone here, and that story, I was right in your world because I've been in several officer-involved shootings. I was a captain when I retired, but I spent a lot of time as a street cop, a lot of years. Saw a lot of things happen, was involved in many things, and he's right. But I want you to think about what he said in this conversation about the worst-case scenario, about thinking like that hypervigilance. It is a tear-down to the soul. All day long, you're thinking these terrible things might happen. Like he just said a minute ago, I'm thinking if someone bursts in this room, what am I going to do? Is that a normal conversation that you have with yourself? Probably in today's world, it's a little more prevalent than it would have been maybe 20 years ago before so many active shootings happened. But I mean, all day long, your worst case scenario, everything. You're trying to survive out there on the street, so you're thinking all the possibilities that can happen. From the time you receive just a normal call, hey, there's a guy refusing to leave at the 7-Eleven, whatever it is, already you're thinking, what am I going to do if? What am I going to do if? What am I going to do if? And let me tell you something, turning that off is hard, because you get home to your family and you're still hypervigilant, okay? And your wife is telling you, hey, dinner's ready, and you're like, no, it isn't. It's not ready for 3 more minutes. And it is like you're testing everyone around you's veracity constantly. You're trying to verify the truth in every situation. Your trust and your ability to trust gets eroded. It's really, really complicated. And as time goes by, it just becomes normal to think like this. You always know, you guys walk in a room, I guarantee if you go to a restaurant, you'll know who the cops are in that room, because they're the same as the mobsters. They're sitting with their back to the wall, okay? And they're looking around. They're not looking at who they're with. They're not enjoying themselves, really. A part of them is not enjoying life right in that moment. And that is a hard thing to separate yourself from. So I just want to add to that, because I think it's something that we really need to, going forward, the hypervigilance is incredibly important. It's a survival skill. It keeps you alive out on the street. But turning it on and off is the difficult part, I would say.
Dr. Trudy Gilbert Elliott has worked with thousands of first responders over the years. Can you draw upon your experience in the military and also highlight the similarities that you observed when you started working with first responders?
Thanks for having me. That's a good question. I find that, so I worked for the military before I came here to Las Vegas. I worked for the National Guard for a few years, and the reason I had a job was because they had deployed so many times from my base. I had people who had deployed 10, 11, 12 times even over the course of 10 or 12 years even. So they'd spend that many years in either Iraq or Afghanistan, that the suicide rates began to climb so high that they ended up embedding clinicians like myself all across the United States on these little bases. And I loved working for the military because they are very, very strong, they're very courageous, and when an officer or an airman or a soldier would come into my office, basically it was fix me. It was like, tell me what to do, I want to start right now, fix me. And that's been my experience with law enforcement and with the firefighters I work with too, is that they're incredibly courageous and they want the prescription right away. What do I need to do? What do I need to change? How do I need to operate in life that will end up making this, whatever is going on with me, go away? I worked for a lot of years before this. I've even worked inpatient psych, so I worked in inpatient psychiatric hospital. And I can't tell you how different it is to work with a group of people who are able to have that much self-insight and that much self-awareness and courage that they would be able to identify what's going on and say, let's get to work. Because a lot of times, as a therapist, I've had to work very, very, very hard with some people, and my work seems almost effortless because people are that willing to get the help that they need.
So according to case studies from the U.S. Department of Justice, stress can lead to, quote, major psychological illnesses such as acute stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. Dr. Gilbert Elliott, can you elaborate more on just the psychological impact of stress and the demands on first responders?
So, you know, I often will, when an officer comes in, especially after an officer-involved shooting, I often explain to them, because for officers, my experience with explaining PTSD, because most people who are lay people, they understand PTSD like in the context of, like, let's say, a war, or they understand it in the context of like someone who is in a really severe car accident, and that thing happened, and then the person ends up with PTSD. For law enforcement, for anybody in first responder world, it's a very, very different process for them oftentimes, because they are very stoic, because they are very strong, and because the training is so well done for across the board, they learn some really good techniques in dealing with their feelings and dealing with the reactions to this overexposure with trauma. But you're still human. And I use the analogy with officers. It'd be like if I was a runner and I just ran and ran and ran and ran and ran for years and years and years and years, and all of a sudden one day I stepped off the curb and my knee gives out. Now I could blame it on that curb that day that my knee gives out, but in reality it wasn't. That's not the reason my knee gives out. It's because I put thousands of miles on my knee, right? Well, your brain is exactly the same exact way. So if you're pounding that brain and expecting it to absorb trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, it's going to eventually buckle under you in some way or another. It's described as death by 1,000 cuts, is what it really is. It's just too much. In an ideal world, the brain actually needs 3 to 4 weeks to recover from a trauma. That's what it needs. So that's in an ideal world, and it's wonderful that after an OIS, Metro does allow them that 3 or 4 weeks to recover from that trauma. But the average officer is seeing traumatic content every single shift, and they're not getting 3 to 4 weeks to recover from it. So over time, those little tiny cuts accumulate, and sometimes they will end up with over-the-top hypervigilant, not functional hypervigilance, but over-the-top hypervigilance. They'll also start doing some little tiny adjustments, maybe things like, I'm going to avoid driving by that place, or I'm going to avoid talking about that thing, or I'm not going to hang out with that person, or I'm not going to go do that, in an effort to preserve some energy, and then their sleep starts to become disturbed, and so on and on and on, and so it isn't like you arrive at that place like instantaneously. It's just this. It's just a constant. I was sharing with somebody earlier, one of the nice things I'm seeing is a lot of younger officers are coming to see me, which is wonderful, because they've heard about me, which is great, so people are talking. So they're not getting referred necessarily by PEEP. They're getting referred by one of their peers who's talking about, like, this has really helped me. I go in and I have somebody I can talk to, and et cetera, et cetera. So, because to me, if you can gain more skills to deal with a very, very long career absorbing that much trauma, yeah, you have a really good shot at ending up in a pretty good place, potentially, at the end of that career. And then on the other hand, I do see quite a few people who waited until right before retirement or at retirement and realizing I'm not doing well, and I know I'm not doing well, and I need to make sure that I go into retirement and that I have the retirement I've always dreamed of. But again, a bunch of courageous people who are willing to look at themselves and won't bury their head in the sand, that's for sure. So,
Yeah, Shakayla, and PTSD and policing is such an accepted and ailment that a lot of us fall to, that some people aren't aware that in 2019, the Nevada State Legislature added PTSD as a compensable workers' comp injury, an industrial injury. So same like there is for a heart disease for police officers, it's presumed because of the difficult and stressful job they have that if they develop heart disease, it's already a presumptive illness, it's presumed it has arisen out of their career. Same for PTSD. So that's a great thing that started in 2019 for our employees to not take advantage of, but to utilize.
Yeah. I also just want to add, because I think it's important to acknowledge that you also, Dr. Gilbert-Elliott, work with fire personnel, doctors, and nurses too. What similarities have you observed between those professions?
Yeah, most of the time, if they do end up with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress, their onset is very similar. It's usually what we would call a slow onset. They usually also have what would be considered complex PTSD as opposed to simple PTSD. Simple PTSD is what we would usually diagnose with a car accident, because it's the week before nothing had happened to you, you were just fine, and then that week, now all of a sudden we see something beginning to happen. So with doctors and with nurses too, they also come from cultures that are very, very stoic and very strength-based. And I would say, it's interestingly enough, we've been working with Metro for about 10 years now, and they're a little slower behind the curve. I mean, Metro's really doing an amazing job. The military did a really amazing job because they knew they needed to. It used to be that if you sought help, you were going to be discharged from the military. That is not the case anymore. Same thing with Metro. You seek help, you're going to end up most likely going back to full duty. You're going to be fine. But with doctors and nurses, they do have a little bit of a harder time seeking help, because it isn't as accepted yet, at least not in Vegas that I've known of, and certainly not in Reno where I used to work too. It's just not as prevalent and not as accepted within the culture yet.
So the evening of October 1st, 2017 marked a devastating event for the Las Vegas community and the nation. Over 900 officers responded to the call of a mass shooting on the Strip. 58 people were killed. Sergeant Travis Maka was one of the first responders to that shooting. Can you walk us through that night and provide some insight into how your department responded to that event?
Yes, first of all, thanks for having me. When I think about that night, I had interactions with two of the victims, and those interactions will stay with me for the rest of my life, and I apologize ahead of time. It's been 6 years, but I still get choked up when I talk about it. It was just another Sunday. I remember we were in briefing. I was working overnight. 10 o'clock, we're in briefing, and we're very close to the Mandalay, where the High Patrol Southern Command offices are. And when we get the call that there's an active shooter on the 30th floor, Mandalay Bay, and so we're all heading down there. I'm racing down Sunset, trying to get to the. At this time, we don't even know what's at a concert venue's involved. We're just told Mandalay Bay, 30th floor. That's all we know. And we're racing down there, and all of a sudden I get on Las Vegas Boulevard and I see this pickup truck coming at me. And they're swerving all over the place, flashing our lights, and there's this woman hanging out the passenger side of the window up to her waist, waving her arms wild at me. And up to this point, heading to this event, I'm having thoughts in my head like this isn't really what they're saying it is. Just a few weeks ago, we got the same call at Dre's nightclub, and it was somebody knocked over a planter or something, and everyone thought it was a shooting. This isn't a shooting. And I just having those doubts in my mind, like I'm preparing for it, but at the same time I have my doubts. And all of a sudden I see this, and this is okay, this is odd. I slow down, and the lady's screaming at me that they have victims in the bed of her truck, and they're dying. I look in the bed of the truck, and I just see people stacked on top of people laying across the length of the bed of this Dodge. And so I tell her, and at this point, they're heading southbound as I'm coming northbound, and I'm trying to think, they got gunshot victims, and they're not going the right direction as I'm at Sunset. And so I tell them to follow me, I'm going to get them help. And I try to get onto the I-15 to get them headed to UMC Trauma, to get them the only trauma center equipped for the kind of injuries that it sounds like we have in this vehicle. And trying to get him to the hospital. I'm going through some congestion in the panicked traffic that night, and every second's feeling like an hour, and I'm starting to freak out. I'm stuck behind this truck. I can't get him to move, and finally I'm splitting lanes, forcing people out until I can get to where the other people at the Highway Patrol had already started shutting down the entire I-15. I was on my way to Blue Diamond to help shut that down, and then I had never made it there when I encountered this truck. And so I'm stuck in the congestion I created by not getting to my post. But once I got to Russell and things cleared up, I was able to get to UMC very quickly. And then that's when it became very real for me, what we were dealing with. I had Metro officers on every street corner surrounding UMC trauma. It almost looked like something like you would see from a war movie or something, where they're an occupation, where there's wearing their ballistic helmets, got their plates on, rifles out on every corner around Rancho and Charleston. And so I'm thinking, okay. So we get into the front of UMC trauma, and now I'm seeing people being triaged out in the parking lot. At this point, I'd been on the department a few years. I've never seen anything like that before at UMC. I've never seen people being treated in the parking lot. And by the time I got my car parked and I got back to that truck, they were already all inside. I didn't make contact with any of them. And I took down the license plate, kind of left it, let dispatch know and asked where they needed me next. Raced back down to the strip, and then they set me up on a closure where I'm kind of right in the shadow of Mandalay Bay, down by the Welcome Las Vegas sign, and I'm shutting down traffic getting onto the I-15 from Las Vegas Boulevard. And that's when I start hearing the radio traffic coming over, where we're having what we call like echo calls, where we're getting calls up, and they're giving us descriptions. 6 foot, black over black, carrying an assault rifle, walking through Caesar's Palace. We got shots fired at the Paris, shots fired at the New York. And I train with Metro a lot in what's called MACTAC, where we prepare for these kind of events. And we study previous mass casualty events. And so in my mind right now, I'm thinking Mumbai. I'm thinking, how many shooters we got down here? And now, at this point, I'm on Las Vegas Boulevard. It's like a ghost town. The only cars you see driving are emergency vehicles. Airplanes have quit flying. There's no air, and I mean, you're right there next to the airport, and you don't see any airplanes flying overhead. It's eerily quiet, and all of a sudden, I just see hordes of people walking up the boulevard towards me, people walking out of alleyways, and I'm hearing all this on my radio about active shooters all over the strip. And now I'm starting to think I'm out here by myself. I got my place, got my rifle, and I'm scanning waistbands, scanning hands, looking for, don't know what's coming my direction. And remember being very, like Captain Fagel said, my hypervigilance was in overdrive at that point. I'm freaking out there by myself, just rapidly scanning, and next thing I know, I have a pickup truck coming up to me, and there's a couple in the back of this pickup truck. There's one wrapped tightly in a sheet. And her husband's clutching onto her with everything he's got. I mean, you can see his arm shaking. And the driver of the truck is explaining to me that they've been circling Las Vegas on the highways, trying to find someone to help her. That she had been shot in the concert venue, and she's been deceased. They were able to get an AMR ambulance to actually confirm she's deceased, but they couldn't take her. They had to save the room on the bus for people they can help. There's no helping her. And so now this guy's just driving around Las Vegas with the remains of this poor woman in the back of his truck, and he doesn't know what to do with her. And while they're explaining this to me, I'm staring in the bed of this truck at this man who's looking up at me, and we made eye contact. And that will always haunt me because I've always prided myself of always having the right thing to say. I can handle problems. I'm here to fix things for people. Now I'm staring at this guy, and I'm frozen. I don't know what to say to him. He's lost everything in his life. And I'm sitting there like an idiot, just staring at this poor man as he's clutching onto his dead wife, who turned out to be Denise Berditas, one of the 58 we lost. And I've never felt so useless in my career. I wanted so badly to bring this poor man some comfort, and I had nothing for him. But we were able to actually had an Arizona state trooper who just happened to be in town for a convention come out to our scene, and he escorted him to St. Rose Hospital. So, she can be removed from this pickup and given some dignity. And that was rough. So I get through the night. I finally get debriefed at 8 in the morning, and that was the first time I've really felt like an adrenaline dump in my career, where I felt like I couldn't get out of the chair. After we got debriefed, I just felt like I melted into the chair and didn't have the energy to stand up and go home. But we got up, got home, and then I would start inquiring about like what happened with the people I had in that truck. Did anybody heard anything? And I had one of our sergeants tell me that no, they don't believe the person in your truck survived. And that was devastating to me, because I just went back to how these people had flagged me down with desperation and trusted me with the lives of everyone in that truck to help them. They put their lives in my hands, and I failed them. Somebody died on my watch when I was supposed to be there to come through for them, and I go back to thinking how long I felt like I was on that highway, and I should have got around that truck sooner. I should have gone faster. I should have done this. I really was in a mentally bad place at that point. I failed these poor people. And then a few days passed by, and I get a call through the department where somebody's trying to get a hold of me, and they passed on his number, and they said it's related to the 1 October shooting. And it turns out the driver of that truck had remembered my license plate and called the highway patrol and was trying to find me. And I'd call him, and he told me who he was and that, and he explained to me what the story they went through. And as it turns out, the people in the back of this truck was a family from Lancaster, California, who were visiting in Las Vegas. And they had 2 twin daughters who were in their early 20s, beautiful girls. And the father's explaining that they're enjoying the concert, shots start ringing out, and the one girl who was in really bad shape in the back of that truck, Taylor, was struck in the arm and had catastrophic nerve damage and arterial damage. And the blood spray from her being shot sprayed all over her twin sister, who immediately fainted. And this poor father thought he just lost both of his beautiful twin daughters in an instant like that. And they both dropped. He was then shot in the foot, and he made a makeshift tourniquet, placed it on Taylor, and Taylor, him and his wife got separated from the rest of their party with the other daughter and ended up in the parking lot at the church behind the venue. And they were huddled between some cars and flagged down this local family who was fleeing from the scene and told them, we're out of town, we don't know where to go, and if you don't help me, my daughter's gonna die. And these brave people, who normally, you've seen it so many times in horrible situations like this, will step over each other to get out of there, stopped as shots are still ringing out, and took these strangers and put them in the back of their truck and took off. And at that point, they encountered me. And then he gave me the information to reach out to that family, and I was able to contact them. And come to find out, Taylor survived. And that saved me. Taylor's strength, and I mean, she's just a little tiny thing. And to take a rifle round to her arm like that, and they showed me they sent me pictures of her injuries and her x-rays, and just the amazing strength of this young woman to survive that saved me as far as I can tell, because at that point, I was still at home, and I was kind of angry at the time at the department, because I'm at home staring at the walls, dealing with my guilt and my failures, and all I want to do is go back to work and think about something else. Think about the job, do something to occupy my mind, and I'm stuck at home because they won't let me return to duty until I see a therapist. And I thought that was absolutely ridiculous. I signed up to do this, I can handle it, I'm gonna go back to work. And now I'm being told, that I failed and the young lady didn't survive. And then once I do find out she miraculously survived, and I had gotten her to the hospital just in time to have life-saving surgery, it made all the world to me. And a few months later, I was actually able to meet her and the family, and it was extremely healing for me. But I have to say, though, at first being angry that I couldn't return to work, and I had to sit there and stare at the walls of my house all this time until I could have my appointment with a therapist, was driving. I was glad they did it, because once I did have that, I realized that I thought I was okay, But once I met with the therapist and spent several hours talking, and I felt a lot better. And then I felt 100 times better once I found out that she did actually survive. But what the doctor was saying about it being PTSD being death by 1,000 cuts, I definitely can relate to that. Because on top of the 1 October event, just as a law enforcement officer, and I'm with Highway Patrol, we're traffic officers. But I'm recently coming off a position before I promoted where I was the public information officer, and I'm required to go to every critical incident that our department's involved in. I've been on hundreds of fatals at this point. And to see the devastation that people go through in these violent crashes and when they lose loved ones, and that's what really sticks with me. And 1 October, I will never forget, but it's just the day-to-day of just having to deal with that and just seeing human suffering. I can handle looking at mangled bodies. I can handle the gore and violence of it. But when you see it's the family members and those who survived and those who are being left behind and their trauma, that's what sticks with me, their anguish. Being a traffic officer, I mean, I've seen several fatal scenes where the cell phone's laying in the car and you can see the text messages scrolling. Where are you? Come home. I'm worried. You know this person's not coming home. And so that's the part that I really have a struggle with, is just the empathy for our few people we're serving, and when their lives have been just shattered. And once again, it brings me back to when I was with Denise Berditis' husband, where I want so badly to bring these people some relief, and I can't. And that's probably what haunts me more than anything else in this career.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Bill, can you talk about your experience with 1 October and PEEP's role as well that night?
Sure. Sergeant Mack and I were talking a little bit about this before tonight's program began. We have a really good relationship with Highway Patrol. In fact, I chair a board, which is the Las Vegas Valley Peer Support Coordinators Coalition. It's all the other agencies, what I do for Metro, the other entities that do that for their agencies. We meet quarterly, and we've been doing that since 2015, which was a godsend because we have only 6 peer support liaisons in our agency. We have over 6,000 employees. We had several hundred employees who were intimately involved in the incident that night. So after every critical incident, it's our section that makes contact with all the involved employees, right? How are we going to even tackle that? Well, thankfully, like I said, we've had this relationship with the coalition here in town. It's 24 state, local, and federal agencies. They're able to tap into them and have them help us make those contacts, come over to Metro and actually help us do our debriefs. So that's how such a small section was able to take on such a monumental task at our agency. It wasn't just us, it was relationships that we've built prior to. And I've spoken across the country to different agencies who are trying to start their own peer support programs, and that's the one thing I stress to them is you don't want to just build it within your own agency. You want to build that coalition outside your agency. We have our police chaplains, and there's a couple of them here tonight. We tap into those folks and use them very heavily as an extension of our section. We have 19 police chaplains, and we're lucky to have them. Those are people that volunteer their time to our agency. They're not paid employees, but boy, they work, and they have a hard job. So we tapped into them heavily after 1 October. Sadly, we had an officer that was killed in the line of duty that night. So we were dealing with that as well, trying to find out which hospital he was taken to, because folks were taken to every hospital across the valley. So trying to locate Officer Hartfeld's body, locate his widow, have the sheriff, by policy, the sheriff is supposed to make notification to the family after we've lost somebody. Boy, we were fighting to make that happen and do the right thing. And fortunately, we were able to get it done, but it wasn't easy. And it wasn't just that night. It was all the work moving forward. Poor Dr. Gilbert, she understates her role with our agency. She was utilized heavily after 1 October and continues to be, as do we have 3 clinicians that our agency contracts with. And Dr. Gilbert is one of them, and we're thankful to have her. But it was the work moving forward. Yeah, it was a difficult night that night. It was very hard. I'm not going to understate that. But it was the work moving forward, and we're continuing to have repercussions from 1 October. As Dr. Gilbert can attest to, PTSD, you don't suffer from that immediately after your event. It's why it's long after 30 days, I believe, is the criteria that it has to know earlier than that, but it could be years later. So we're still contending with that. So the work's not done.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So, like specifically 1 October?
1 October and the work that followed.
Well, I kind of had a unique experience with 1 October myself because my own daughter was at the counter and she was shot. And so I was kind of having two minds during the several weeks after that because I was dealing, I went out that night and I ended up at St. Rose, which is where she was transported to with a group of people. And my daughter's a nurse, and so bless her heart, she's in the rig with a shot arm, and she's laying out the IVs for the other patients in the rig, which I thought was in the ambulance. And so she ends up getting to the hospital, and then my work began. So I was keeping in touch with her. She lived in LA. She worked at UCLA at the time, and keeping in touch with her and making sure she's getting the help she needed. And then I geared up. I actually worked 13, 14-hour days, to be honest with you, right in the aftermath because there was such a need. And because I only see first responders, you can imagine there's an awful lot of folks that had a lot to unpack. I am still seeing people, even this past year at the 5-year anniversary, a few people said, yeah, I guess I need to see somebody because they just kept trying to work it out on their own and trying to be okay. And it's interesting. One of the things that happens very often when I'm listening to somebody's story, so when someone comes in and they're, like, let's say it's right after an OIS, or they come in because of something like 1 October, I always say, tell me the story. And that's actually how I start the session. I say, tell me the story of your experience. And they're going to tell me the story, and I'm listening for a few things. One, I'm listening for how coherent the story is, how clear it is from beginning to end. Are there a lot of gaps in the story? Is it a pretty like clear narrative? But I'm also listening for the explanations of what happened. And some of the things I'm listening for guilt. I'm listening for regret. I'm listening for judgment of self. Because if I hear those things, I know what direction I'm going in with that treatment plan, because that's usually what happens in the aftermath is how you explain the event to yourself is a big part of how PTSD ends up happening. So if I explain the event as I'm a strong person and I've overcome something difficult and versus I explain it to myself as I could have, I can't believe I didn't do more. I should have done this. I should have done that. Other people are thinking this about me. That usually is an indication that the person is explaining the event to themselves in ways that might have some embedded distortions in it that we're going to have to unpack so that we can then look at the way that they wrote that story in their own head and then look at it and see if there's maybe a better way to write it, a better way to explain it to themselves. And that's the power of treatment, is that because a lot of times when something, I don't know about you, but when something's rattling around in my head, it sounds really good. but when I say it out loud to one of my friends and they kind of get this look on their face like, oh, what's going on with you, Trudy? So that's why it's so important to say things out loud, because another person is so much better equipped to see the distortion in one of my own stories than I am myself. And so that's what therapy, a big part of what we do in the aftermath of trauma, is we're helping people see how they packaged up that story in a way that actually might be doing harm to them. And so we want to take it out, we want to look at it, and we want to repackage it in a way that speaks to their strength and speaks to their overcoming and speaks to their resiliency instead.
Now, Harry, you've been quite open about your experience with PTSD and specifically about those first 6 months after you retired. What was your experience like transitioning from an active duty role to retirement, and how it affected your mental health?
Okay. Well, During my career, I was in many traumatic situations, not to mention 1 October as one of them, but many others. And early on, I got divorced, and I met a therapist through that divorce. We went to counseling, and I kind of enjoyed the conversation. So I was like, this could be useful, in the future for stress. So I started seeing this therapist. This is early on in my career, and as things happened in the police business, I would talk to my therapist about it, and he gave me tools that helped me deal with the stress. So I was like, why isn't this more widespread? This is like helping me get through all of this stuff, because I could tell you, I've been on calls where a father cut his daughter's head off, okay? And I went back to work a half an hour later after that, and I was back doing stuff. And that's just one of thousands of examples, and he can say them, and he can say them, and I'm sure any cop in the room could say them. But after a while, you're just constantly in this place where this stuff happens. So I found it very powerful to talk to a therapist. And once I did, I started talking about it to the people I work with, because I'm not afraid of anybody. It's just not, it doesn't exist to me for that. I'm afraid of stuff, but I'm not really afraid of myself or the people around me. So I was like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't we all doing this to get stronger with the stuff that we're encountering? And it fell on deaf ears because of the stoicism and everything else. But slowly but surely, there's small incremental things happening where people are realizing, hey, maybe, Harry said that thing worked for him. Why not? I'll try it. And, there's a lot of roadblocks. There's a lot of obstacles in getting therapy when you're a cop, because, first of all, there's the stigma. Then there's the fact that who do you go to? Who do you trust? Who do you talk to? Because most of the department will provide you people, but I guarantee you that the people that the department gives you, there's going to be some trust issue with the cops that are going to talk to them. And they're going to think, oh, they're going to go right back and tell somebody, and they're going to know. So it's a difficult and complicated problem. But slowly but surely, I've seen more things happening. My therapist died. I found a new therapist, and I would call it Band-Aiding. I didn't really fix the trauma. But when something really bad would happen, eventually I would go, I'm going to go call my therapist, and I'll sit down and be able to hash this out, throw a Band-Aid on it, and go back out there. There was no weeks of breaks ever or anything like that, unless I was in shootings, which I was in a few shootings, and there would be breaks, and those were good. And you would have a chance to deal with the stress. And it was good to have that time. But normally, you don't have any time. So I pushed and pushed and pushed for people to go talk to therapists, and nobody would listen to me. Well, some people did, I guess. But then, as I got longer in my career, people started killing themselves. People started committing suicide. It started when I was younger, but then it just seemed like more and more cops were taking their own lives, more first responders, firemen that I knew, people in the medical business as well. And so I'm paying attention. I'm like, we need to do something about this. This is a serious problem. And there were people on the department at the time who took a significant effort to try to spread the word, do a PSA, if you will, for the police officers internally to say, hey, there's no harm in going to get some help. But, once again, PSAs, they take over and over and over again. And so it kind of fizzles out. Then you're just back to going to some terrible thing, and just that's how you spend your day. When I retired, I was still seeing the therapist, but really intermittently. It was a Band-Aid occasionally, Band-Aid occasionally. And I got off and I left, and all of a sudden my identity went into a place it's never been before. I didn't know what to do with myself. I had spent every waking minute of my day responsible for people, responsible for their lives and safety, not just the people that worked for me, but for the people in our community. And believe me, it still matters to me, okay? Your safety matters to me just as much as my own. I want everyone to get along and be healthy and happy for as long as they can. That's kind of my attitude in life. And it's hard to do in this world, but it's a good attitude to have. But when I retired, man, I don't know what happened. I just got real unhappy. And I felt like I was all by myself, literally, when it came to the department. I felt there was nothing coming from them. And all I heard at a million different retirements was, you're part of the Metro family. When you get done, and I know it's the same at other police departments, you're part of the family, and then all of a sudden you go there to do something, and they're like, who are you? Well, I was a captain here. Nobody cares. Go get in line. And you're like, wow, this is not a family. Well, maybe it is. It depends on your family, I guess. But I started drinking quite a bit. I don't know how to explain it. It was like spiraling downward is the only way I can say. Sleep went away. I wasn't sleeping well. I was having bad nightmares. And what I really didn't know what I was doing at the time was I was probably processing a lot of stuff, okay? Just processing. I finally had a chance to relax, and instead of enjoying it, I was reliving these experiences. And my wife, who's in the room right now, who I owe so much to, I promise you, and our relationships are so incredibly important when we're policemen. We have got to work, our relationships are what save us, both our relationships with our peers and our relationships with our families. And my wife is an incredibly powerful person and really strong in my life, and I could see her getting frayed from my behavior. Her parts were coming undone from my behavior, my words, my attitude. And she basically said to me, you know, you need to do something. So I went to intense therapy. And I paid the money because I still didn't trust the department, to be honest. I didn't want them to know any of my business. And I wouldn't go through them. And all the times I went to therapy when I was at Metro, I did it on my own dime. I paid for it out of my pocket. I didn't use insurance. And the reason was because I did not trust it. And I'm just telling you the truth. But I'm glad I went. And when I retired, my therapist helped me rebuild my identity. And I cannot tell you what an incredibly powerful and satisfying thing that is in my life now. I've been retired for 4 years. There's balance in my life. My marriage is as beautiful as ever with 25 years down. I got 2 children, and I am so happy to be alive and talking to you right now. Because I can tell you, and I have talked to many of my peers, and I've talked to my subordinates, and I've talked to my mentors and bosses. And I can't tell you how many have stood in a dark place and contemplating ending themselves in their career. It would blow your mind to know how many. People that you would be shocked, and I would never reveal their identity out of their, but I begged them to go, and they did. The ones that were there, in that moment, they went and got some help. That help needs to be widely available, and it needs to be part of the process from the time you're in the academy to the time that you leave. It should be at the fire department. It should be at in the doctors and nurses. You're right. Anywhere where you're standing in the blood of other people all day long, it should just be part of the fabric. You go and you train with your firearms, and you train with your defensive tactics, and you learn the laws of the land, and you keep yourself relatively fit. But I can tell you by the time I left, I was unhealthy, okay? Unhealthy. The stress had eaten me to a place where I think if I'd have stayed any longer, I would have died. I would have had a heart attack. I was 60 pounds heavier. I would sit in a room in the morning, and my heart rate was 128 beats per minute, sitting in our 7:30 meeting. Just sit in a chair, and I knew I need to do something. So I retired, and then all this went on, and now I'm in a better place. So I am hoping that conversations like this, thank you, Dr. Tu, for all of the help you've given so many people. Just thank you from the bottom of my heart. And for you for taking on the responsibility, and you as well, Travis. You know, and I should call you Sergeant, huh?
No, you outrank me, sir.
But the truth of the matter is that we have got to find the compassion in ourselves and for the others that we work with, and put the tough guy stuff aside on this stuff. You need to be tough in the job. There's no question about it. You have to be. You have to be able to stand up to adversity, and that is no simple, small thing. And you have to be trained for it, and you have to be physically ready for it and mentally ready for it. But I'm hopeful that as these things move forward in law enforcement and other first responder careers, that mental health is part of the package from day one. It is just as important as working out. It is just as important as eating right. It's just as important as learning the laws of the land. It's just as important as knowing how to use your firearms and all that other stuff. Because if you ain't right in your head, what does any of that matter? And if you spend a career helping out other people, and at the end of it you take your own life, or you're a miserable drunk, or you're unhappy and your life is destroyed, then what was the point of helping all those people if you can't help yourself? So I'm hopeful, guys, moving forward. Let's see more of this, please.
Lastly, I just want to mention, so many law enforcement agencies across the country have now developed a comprehensive and early prevention and intervention strategy to address mental health. And the new Sheriff Kevin McMahill, has implemented a wellness bureau within the department. And Bill Gibbs, I'm hoping that you can just briefly comment on this, on the importance of these strategies and PEEP's work with this new Wellness Bureau.
It's very, very important. Like Harry talked about, the beginning of his career, he started his career just like we would love to see officers do. You know, he was seeing a clinician on a regular basis. When you do that, you're processing what you're going through as you go through your career, rather than tucking it away, that I'm going to compartmentalize this. I can tuck it away and deal with it. I'll deal with it later. Well, you can only stuff so much in before it starts seeping out. And how does it seep out? Destroyed marriages, alcohol abuse, suicide. Harry mentioned suicide. When I got into law enforcement, people were saying, oh, that's such a dangerous job you're doing. That's a dangerous job. It's a scary world out there, right? And it is. It could be scary. But the biggest threat to any police officer is himself or herself over the environment they work in. Since 1983, when our agency started keeping suicide statistics, we've lost 18 officers in the line of duty. We've lost 39 officers to suicide. So what's the bigger threat? What's the bigger danger? It's not taking care of ourselves. And so Kevin McMahill, sheriff, he's been with our agency for a long time. He sees that. He's a good man, and says it's time to start, in his words, injecting humanity.
Thank you, Kevin.
These aren't robots that work for us. These are human beings. Not only worried about their mental well-being, but their physical well-being, spiritual, financial. We're going to take his plan, his vision is to take care of the whole person. And they're now just starting to put this program together. They haven't done anything super big with it yet because they're doing a lot of research. They're doing best practice across the country research. Eventually, we're going to hire a clinician full-time on our agency, which is what we've needed for a long time. We contract with clinicians, but for instance, LAPD has 16 full-time psychologists working with their agency. We have 0. We contract with some folks, but that's going to change. We're going to have a full-time clinician working with us.
Thank you, Kevin.
And he started to do some just little changes that what change could you make today that's going to improve the wellness of our employees, and not just officers, all of our law enforcement employees. Something simple like the vending machines. What's usually in a vending machine? Cookies, junk, all stuff that's bad for you, right? So he has a company come in, give us a bid, take a look at our vending machines, where they're placed, and giving healthy food options in the vending machine. So they're not eating garbage. If you can't go out for lunch and I got to grab something out of a vending machine, it's going to be something healthy, right? This might not seem like a wellness thing, but it is. What makes people feel better, right? Some people like to have facial hair. They like to have a beard. Harry likes to have a beard, but he couldn't have that when he was working.
Well, I'm just trying to balance.
He couldn't have that when he worked for us. But if Harry were working for us today, he could have that beard. And it seems like a simple change, but those are the little things. Wool pants, a big deal? You wouldn't think so unless you worked out in 117-degree weather in wool pants in the desert.
You don't know hot.
Now it's a big deal, right? So instituting, hey, we're going to look into what is the best option for us for alternative uniforms for pants for our folks. Now, I was happy with the wool pants. I wore double-layer wool pants as a motor officer, and I've been struck twice by other vehicles when I was as a motor, and I slid across the roadway on my butt and just lost 1 layer of pants and no skin. So I was happy for those pants. But for ordinary patrol officer, getting them in a more functional, workable uniform, that has an impact. All those little things lead to big things. So, like I said, we're in the early exploratory stages. They've made some changes where they could, but it's going to continue to improve, and I expect good things out of it.
Thank you. So we have reached the end of our program. We do have a few minutes to answer any questions from the audience. I want to start with a question that was submitted from the Nevada Independent, and anyone is open to answer this question. What is the #1 goal for police officers when they are patrolling, working, or answering disturbance calls?
Well, number 1's to go home at the end of the night.
Everyone goes home. Suspect, victim, witness, and cop. The same way they went out, maybe a little tired.
Exactly. Preservation of life, and that's everybody's life.
100%.
Exactly, right?
Any other questions from the audience? We have one right here. If you will just wait until we get this mic to you.
I have a question just for the entire panel, whoever feels, they can answer it. As a citizen, who has no law enforcement experience whatsoever, what can I do to help?
Be kind. Be kind. It goes a long way. When people come up and say thank you, it means a lot. People come up and ask you all kinds of things when you're out there working. It's nice to hear a thank you. It's nice to hear, hey, are you doing okay? Would you like a water? I've heard that before. It's just being a human. And you should be treated the same way as well. And that's how it should be.
Yeah, you hear very often, I don't know why anybody would want to get into law enforcement because people have such a negative attitude towards police. But I'll tell you, in the Las Vegas Valley,
It's great.
we don't suffer from that. And that's all you can do is continue to support us like you've done. There are some agencies across the country, they don't have the support of their citizens. And maybe it's some fault of their own. Maybe they're not as transparent as we are. After an officer-involved shooting, within 72 hours, we have a statement given out by our executive staff spelling out what happened, right? We're not going to comment on it because it's an open investigation and just leave it at that. That's not good for relationships with your community. Well, we appreciate that.
Is there another question? Right over here.
So just a quick question. As someone who's in school for criminal justice, and Sergeant Smacker, you may not remember me, but I interned with you and did a ride-along. We went to that charter school, and they thought it was a shooting. CCSD police responded. But as someone who's been diagnosed with, I guess, mild PTSD and wanting to get into law enforcement, eventually, would you say that's an uphill battle? Trying to even just get a foot in the door?
I wouldn't say so. Just like the captain said, especially if a huge step is you saying right now that you're aware of having some issues in that area, you're going to get the appropriate treatment and go after it. That's the big problem I'm seeing with our profession, and it's getting better, but it's still there, is the stoicism that getting help for your mental health is some kind viewed as weakness, and that's the stigma we got to get past. There's guys who will never go that direction because I'm stronger than that. That's for weak people, and that's completely wrong, and it's getting people killed. And another thing we got to deal with in law enforcement too is, just like the captain said, the trust issue. Because there's a lot of guys who could probably use help, but they're never going to go get that help, because what happens if the department determines that you're not fit for duty? Now there goes your livelihood. And that's what a lot of guys genuinely fear. They're going to suffer in silence because they can't afford to lose their livelihood, and they don't want their job threatened if they're found not fit for duty. So being aware of it and being open with it and getting the help, I think you're probably leaps and bounds with somebody who's probably not even dealing with PTSD at this time, because you've got a plan.
And I can also tell you that PTSD is highly treatable. It's one of the most highly treatable mental health disorders there is. It's a disorder of exacerbations and remissions. So when a person has been diagnosed with PTSD, the goal is to effectively get you into what would be considered remission. In other words, your symptoms are so low that you're actually coping quite well. You might be dealing with, you might be a little bit more of a, I guess what we would call a fragile sleeper. You might still have a little bit of hypervigilance. You might have to work a little harder than maybe just a regular person on your thinking, being really guarding against negative thinking, for example. But you can actually be in what would be considered a remission state for protracted periods of time. Now, are you more vulnerable when you are exposed to a new trauma? Yes. But if you have PTSD, I now know that I need to really do some great self-care because I just got re-exposed. So you would end up being much better at mitigating that than someone who is unaware that they are even diagnosed.
And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on our crisis intervention policy, and that Metro does not toss away its employees who develop PTSD. I met with our folks from Health and Safety yesterday, and I had known this already, that we've never dismissed or terminated anybody for developing PTSD. As Trudy touched on it earlier, the vast majority of our officers who go out either on a critical incident, or our crisis intervention policy will touch on officers who are suicidal. If you admit you're suicidal and I'm having struggles with that, we're going to relieve you of duty. That's to take you off the streets, get you into a facility to be evaluated, get you the treatment you need, and when that clinician says you're good to come back to work, that's what happens. The problem is, like Harry said, getting the folks to trust us, because I can't broadcast somebody's personal business. We've had many, many, many people in my time up with PEEP come through that program, some people of very high rank, who have gotten the treatment they needed and have gone back to work. You don't get your file tag saying you can't promote and you can't transfer to a specialty assignment. That doesn't happen, at least not with our agency.
They've been good, and and I just hope more of it continues. And but here's the thing that people don't realize about therapy. I don't think, maybe doctor, you can expand on that. Is that you learn stuff when you go to a therapist. They teach you tools. It's the same as all the other tools you got. These tools are for you, and they are powerful. It has been an enhancement to my life to learn these things. So I'm hoping more guys do it and gals do it. It's important.
We'll just take one more question right over here.
My husband was a Metro police officer for 33 years. He's been retired now for 22 years. And I lived a very violent life as a child. I survived 2 home invasions. I carry guilt that I could not help my 6-year-old sister because they separated us. I've had a gun put to my head, and he played Russian roulette with my head. One of the men that came to my house that evening was Patrick McKenna with 2 other men. And I'm very lucky to have survived that attack. It was horrendous. I'm 67 years old now, and I kept that buried all my life. And at 17, when my drug addict mother died and my alcoholic father could not raise my sister, I married a police officer because I wanted to be safe. He was a good friend, but I married him because I wanted to be safe. And I've raised 2 wonderful human beings who are law enforcement officers. But I guess my question was, I was damaged at 17 when I married my husband, but he was my angel. He kept me safe. But I ended up in Mount Charleston as 8501 sub, and I was never trained to get on the police radio and to help my husband with his job. And I would handle situations where there was shooting at people on the trail. There was a wolf that dragged a 6-year-old little girl by her stomach into the forest and tried to devour her. I mean, I handled so many police calls and never had the training, but I did the very best that I could. So I went to try to get my sister and I therapy, but I could never find a therapist that I had more life experience than the therapist. So I couldn't find anyone to help us. But when I went through menopause, I'll tell you what, my world went whoa. And that's when it all came out, all the black sludge. Everything came out. And it's taken me 10 years now to really get a grip of it and say, Darla, you did okay. You're a survivor. You did all right. You do have no guilt. You did the best you could. You're alive. So I just wanted to ask, when you talk to Sheriff McMahill, which I voted for, he's a wonderful man, and my other son works for him. My other son is on the stage, and I'm very proud of him, Travis Smacka, Sergeant Travis Smacka. But someone like me, what help could PEEP help a person like me who had a serial killer call my house and want to know when my children were small, how's Travis and Sean? I mean, he would call me all the time. I never got counseling that could help me, you know? I had to do it all on my own. And I do have a psychiatrist that helps, and he calls in, and I talk to him, and we laugh our ass off, really, you know, every time he calls, because he can't believe I'm still alive either. But I just want to thank everybody here that has finally come to this conclusion that, yes, the police officers, they don't need to be worried about their jobs. They need to get help. But how do you help their family that may be suffering?
Great question.
No, we are there for the families and retirees. It gets a little trickier with the retirees, though, because I think I explained that in our office, we don't have any professional clinicians. They're cops, corrections officers, and civilians. And we're there as a sounding board to support our employees and their families and retirees, but we don't practice as clinicians. We refer them to usually, if it's a work-related, that's where Dr. Gilbert will usually step in for officer-involved shootings and other critical incidents, and other treatments as well. But for those folks who maybe are just having, the history that you've had, but you're not a employee of ours, you're not the family of an employee of ours. What?
I once was. I was in the forensic lab.
Right. See, this is what happens when they retire, though, because it boils down to who your insurance is. Because we refer people to our insurance, to behavioral health care options, and in your case, we would tell them, make sure you ask for a clinician that specializes in trauma.
I would have never even sought help because it was a stigma.
Right. But if you were to now contact your own insurance, whoever your provider is, and tell them you want to see a clinician that specializes in trauma, then they'll make that referral for you. That's how we would, if you were to call our office, that's what I would tell you.
I've been to Pete.
Okay.
Okay, we have run out of time.